Marcia was on her way to the cemetery, a journey she repeated every Saturday as a ritual of love and memory that she had cultivated for the past 5 years, since the death of her husband Eduardo. They had been soulmates, inseparable and deeply connected, until a brutal and unexpected illness took Eduardo away. Now, at 55 years old, Marcia lived alone, surrounded by the memories of the life they had shared. Upon arriving at the cemetery, Marcia was greeted with waves and warm salutations from the staff. Everyone knew her story, the woman who, rain or shine, never missed visiting her beloved Eduardo's grave on Saturdays. This recognition and the empathy emanating from those who, in a way, had become an extended part of her family were a small comfort. In her familiar rituals, she replaced the candle and carefully cleaned the tombstone, removing the dried flowers from the previous week. However, that day, Marcia realized she had forgotten to bring new flowers, a rare slip in her meticulous routine. She walked to the cemetery's florist and bought fresh roses, Eduardo's favorites. When she returned, Marcia encountered an unusual scene. A small boy about 7 years old was sitting on Eduardo's grave, alone and with a thoughtful expression. Marcia approached gently, surprised and curious. Hello," as she said with her soft voice, trying not to startle the boy. "Are you okay?" "Yes," the boy replied, looking at her with some surprise in his eyes at being noticed. "Where are your parents?" Marcia asked, looking around, concerned that the boy might be lost. "I don't know where they are," the boy said with a troubling innocence. "I came with a man I don't know very well." "What's your name?" Marcia asked, trying to understand the situation. "Eduardo," the boy replied. The coincidence of the name made Marcia's heart beat faster, a wave of emotion sweeping over her. The same name as my husband," as she thought, surprised and somewhat touched. "Eduardo, who exactly brought you here?" Marcia asked, her concern growing. "A friend of my mom's. She said I could come here to see where people rest. He went to find someone and told me to wait here." Marcia looked around, realizing there were no signs of the man Eduardo had mentioned. She decided not to leave the boy alone and sat down next to him. "Have you been here before, Eduardo?" Marcia asked as she placed the roses on the grave. "No, it's my first time. It's a quiet place, I like it," he said, looking at the roses with interest. "Were these Eduardo's favorite flowers?" "Yes," Marcia explained, feeling strangely comfortable talking to the boy about her husband. "He loved nature." "And my mom also likes flowers," Eduardo said, a shy smile crossing his face. They continued to chat. Marcia, increasingly concerned about the absence of the adult accompanying the boy, decided she could not leave him alone and began to plan what to do next, perhaps involving the cemetery staff or even the police if necessary. During their conversation, little Eduardo, with the simple logic of a child, mentioned that the grave marked with the name Eduardo must belong to his grandfather since they shared the same name. Marcia, although surprised by the coincidence, smiled at the boy's innocence, finding a bit of lightness in the unusual situation. They continued sitting together by the grave, talking about trivial things. Eduardo spoke about his school, his friends, and his favorite games. Marcia, in turn, shared stories about the husband the grave next to them honored. However, as time passed and daylight began to wane, Marcia's concern grew. There was no sign of any responsible adult for the boy, and the cemetery would soon be closing. Finally, deciding she couldn't wait any longer, Marcia took Eduardo to the cemetery staff, asking if anyone had seen an adult looking for a child or if they knew the boy. Unfortunately, none of the staff recognized Eduardo or knew about his companions. Feeling out of options, Marcia called the police, worried but knowing it was the best course of action for the boy's safety. As they waited for the police to arrive, Eduardo began to show signs of anxiety. He looked around nervously, clearly scared, and repeatedly asked about his father. What's your dad's name, Eduardo?" Marcia asked, trying to distract him and gather information that might help. "Dario," the boy replied, swinging his legs nervously. Soon, a police car arrived at the cemetery. Two officers got out and approached Marcia and Eduardo with care and kindness. They asked questions to both, trying to understand the situation and gather as much information as possible. We're going to check the cemetery security cameras to see if we can find out who brought you here, Eduardo, one of the officers explained. The security cameras showed footage of a man wearing a cap, glasses, and a mask leading Eduardo by the hand to Eduardo's grave. With the information provided by the boy, the police were able to find Dario's phone number. When they made contact, they discovered that Dario had been desperately searching for his son after realizing he hadn't returned from his mother's house. Dario quickly drove to the cemetery, anxious but hopeful to find his son safe and sound. Upon arriving, Dario ran towards Eduardo, who, upon seeing him, brightened up with a smile and shouted with joy. The reunion was emotional, with Dario hugging his son tightly and thanking Marcia and the police for taking care of him. The situation at the cemetery remained tense, with the police asking a series of questions about the incident. Marcia, though just an accidental witness, found herself deeply involved, listening to every detail. Dario explained that Eduardo's mother had requested to spend a day with their son, something he had agreed to willingly, never imagining that anything could go wrong. As the hours passed with no news of Dario and Eduardo, anxiety grew even more when the police showed images of an unknown man bringing Eduardo to the cemetery. Dario said he had never seen the man before and was confused and alarmed by the situation. Who was that man, son? Dario asked Eduardo, hoping the boy might provide a clue. I don't know, Daddy. I only know he sometimes went out with Mommy, Eduardo replied, his voice low and hesitant. Did you like him? Dario continued, trying to understand the context. No. He was mean. He would yell at me and Mommy, Eduardo confessed, making Dario frown, anger visible on his face. The police continued their investigation while Dario unsuccessfully tried to call Eduardo's mother, who wasn't answering her phone. This only added to Dario's concern and frustration, fearing for their safety. After a lengthy period of questioning and checking, the police finally released Dario and Eduardo. Before leaving, Dario made sure to approach Marcia, who had been an unexpected and valuable support during the incident. Thank you so much for everything, Marcia. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here with my son, Dario said, genuinely grateful. There's no need to thank me, Dario. I just did what I would hope someone would do for me in such a situation. Take good care of him, Marcia replied, smiling at Eduardo, who shyly returned the smile. Dario and Eduardo walked away, leaving Marcia alone with her thoughts. She made her way slowly back home, the unexpected encounter with Eduardo still echoing in her mind. The boy had been charming and intelligent, and she couldn't help but feel a bit lonely returning to the quiet of her home. Since Eduardo, her husband, had passed away, she often imagined herself surrounded by a larger family, perhaps with grandchildren running through the garden. Yet, that dream had never materialized. In the solitude of her home, Marcia missed the conversation and vibrant presence of little Eduardo. That brief encounter had brought a kind of joy and a welcome distraction to her otherwise solemn Saturday. Now, with the house silent again, she reflected on the strange ways lives can intersect, even under such peculiar circumstances. A few days after the cemetery incident, Marcia received an unexpected call from the local police, informing her that they needed her testimony about what had happened with little Eduardo. Apparently, the case had taken a more serious turn, and her testimony was crucial. With a mix of concern and civic duty, Marcia agreed and headed to the police station at the appointed time. Upon arrival, she was met by a serious officer who promptly informed her of the case's developments. The man who took Eduardo to the cemetery has been arrested. We've discovered he has a long criminal record. I need all the details you can provide about that day, the officer explained, leading Marcia to an interview room. Marcia gave her testimony clearly, recalling every detail of her encounter with the boy and the description of the man who had been captured by the cemetery security cameras. She tried to stay focused, despite the anxiety over the involvement of a child in such a complicated case. After completing her testimony, as she left the room, Marcia ran into Dario in the police station hallway. He looked tired but relieved to see her. Marcia, it's good to see you. Eduardo is at home, safe with the babysitter. The police thought it best for him not to come here to spare him from further difficult situations, Dario said. How is he recovering from all this? Marcia asked, genuinely concerned for the boy's well-being. He's doing okay, considering the circumstances, but there's still a lot to resolve. His mother is giving her statement now, Dario said, glancing briefly toward the interrogation room. Then he turned back to Marcia, as if needing to unburden himself. I should have anticipated this. Eduardo's mother has never been responsible. The day that man took Eduardo to the cemetery, she was drinking with friends and could barely stand. She hardly cares about her son, Dario confessed, frustration evident in his voice. Dario, you couldn't have known this would happen. You're doing the best you can, Marcia tried to offer some comfort, though she knew her words could do little to ease the guilt he felt. I feel guilty for letting her have him, even if just for a day. I promised myself that my son would be safe, and I failed, Dario continued, clearly tormented by the decision he had made. Marcia, although unable to resolve Dario's problems, offered her empathy, listening attentively as he spoke. After a few minutes, Dario thanked Marcia for being there and for everything she had done for Eduardo that day at the cemetery. Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't taken care of him until I arrived. You have a huge heart, Dario said, offering a tired smile. It was nothing, Dario. Anyone would have done the same. I hope this all gets resolved soon for Eduardo's sake, Marcia replied, wishing them strength and resolution. Marcia watched Dario with a mix of sympathy and respect as he confided his fears about Eduardo's future. The bond they shared was deeper than blood, it was one of love and responsibility. He's not my biological son, Dario began to explain, his voice choked with emotion. When I met Eduardo's mother, she was already pregnant. I decided to raise him as my own from the start, but I never officially registered him as my child. Marcia listened attentively, understanding the complexity of the situation. When we separated, she didn't insist on taking the boy and left him with me. I love him as my son and I'm afraid that legally I might lose him one day, Dario continued, his worry palpable. Eduardo is very lucky to have someone like you, Marcia said with conviction. You are the father he knows and loves. That's what really matters. Dario nodded, grateful for Marcia's comforting words. However, their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the interview room door opening. They turned to see who was coming out. Marcia's eyes widened when she saw the woman leaving the room, the last person she expected to find there. With a mix of shock and indignation, she couldn't contain herself. Isabella! She exclaimed, her voice louder than she had intended. Isabella, Eduardo's mother, stopped abruptly, clearly surprised and confused to see Marcia there. Mom, what are you doing here? Isabella asked, her voice trembling slightly. Dario looked from one to the other, trying to understand the connection. Dario, this is my daughter, Marcia explained, still incredulous about the tragic coincidence of the entire plot. Dario was visibly shocked, words taking time to form as he processed the revelation. Isabella, clearly nervous and perhaps a bit defensive, turned to argue with Dario, ignoring Marcia for the moment. Because of you, I'm in big trouble for involving the police, Isabella accused, anger evident in her tone. I didn't call the police, Isabella. It was Marcia, Dario corrected, trying to defuse the situation. Isabella spun abruptly toward Marcia, her face twisted in frustration. Even after all these years, you still find a way to ruin my life, Mom. Isabella shouted, each word laden with resentment. Marcia, although hurt by the accusations, maintained her composure. She was well aware of the pain and complexity in her daughter's words. Isabella, I was here by chance. I found Eduardo at the cemetery, alone and lost. I did what anyone would have done. I called the police because I was worried about his safety, Marcia explained calmly, each word carefully chosen to avoid inflaming the situation further. And no matter what you say, Mom, you always find a way to intrude where you're not wanted, Isabella shot back, clearly unable to see beyond her own frustration. Dario watched the exchange between mother and daughter, feeling both out of place and concerned for Eduardo's well-being. He knew that the family situation was delicate and complex, and while he didn't want to get involved, he felt that Eduardo needed stability and love now more than ever. As Isabella turned and left the station, Marcia felt the weight of the silence that fell between her and her daughter. Each step Isabella took seemed to distance them further from each other. Marcia, overcome with emotion, let her tears fall, mourning the 5 years of estrangement that now seemed deeper and more irreparable. Marcia's tears were still glistening on her face when they were interrupted by the arrival of a police officer. The officer explained the situation, detailing the events that led to Eduardo's temporary disappearance. After picking up her son, Isabella had been invited to a party and irresponsibly left the boy alone at home. Isabella's boyfriend, upon arriving and finding the boy there, expressed his discontent, saying he was tired of the boy's presence and wanted to get rid of him. Knowing Marcia's habits through Isabella, who visited the cemetery every Saturday, he took Eduardo there, hoping that the grandmother would find him and take responsibility. Upon hearing this, Marcia realized the gravity of the situation, not only for herself but for her grandson Eduardo. A mix of emotions overwhelmed her, surprise at discovering she was a grandmother and sadness for her daughter's situation. After the officer left, leaving Dario and Marcia to absorb the news, Dario, now aware that Marcia was Eduardo's grandmother, suggested she go to his home to see the boy. "You must be wanting to see him, right?" Dario asked with a kind tone. "Yes, thank you, Dario. I would really like to," Marcia replied, still trying to adjust to the reality of having a grandson. In the car, as they drove to Dario's house, Marcia opened up about Isabella, sharing the difficulties in their relationship since her daughter's childhood. Isabella has always been a challenging child. We fought a lot because she often got into trouble. As she got older, she simply left home and rarely came back. The last time I saw her was at her father's funeral, and after that, she disappeared completely. She didn't even tell me she had a child, Marcia confided, her words laden with sadness and regret. Upon arriving at Dario's house, Marcia was greeted with a warm hug from Eduardo. The child, with an expression of innocent joy, was soon informed by Dario, gently and carefully, about who Marcia really was. "Eduardo, this is Marcia, your grandmother," Dario said, watching the boy's reaction closely. Eduardo looked at Marcia with a bright smile and responded enthusiastically. "I knew it. The grave where you found me was my grandpa's." The confirmation brought a sense of closure for Eduardo and a new beginning for Marcia. They spent the rest of the day together, talking and getting to know each other better. Marcia quickly realized that, without Dario's dedication, Eduardo might have had a very different fate, perhaps lost in the challenges of urban life without proper guidance. In the following days, Marcia became a regular presence at Dario's house. She visited daily, cherishing each moment to strengthen her bond with Eduardo, who seemed to flourish with his grandmother's attention and love. Dario, although frequently busy with work, was relieved and grateful for Marcia's help, especially during the afternoons when Eduardo was under the care of a nanny. "Marcia, I don't know how to thank you for all your help. Eduardo loves being with you," Dario expressed his gratitude during one of their conversations. "There's no need to thank me, Dario. Taking care of Eduardo is a pleasure for me. He's brought a new purpose to my life," Marcia replied, feeling a peace she hadn't known for a long time. The new routine brought a sense of family and community that both Marcia and Dario deeply valued. However, harmony was interrupted one day by Isabella's unexpected arrival at Dario's house. She announced that she would be taking Eduardo to spend a few days with her, a decision that surprised both Dario and Marcia. "Isabella, are you sure this is best for Eduardo right now?" Dario asked, clearly concerned about the boy's stability. "He's my son, Dario, and I want to spend some time with him. Can't I?" Isabella responded, her tone defensive and firm. Marcia, trying to mediate the situation, decided to talk to Isabella. The conversation quickly grew tense, as it always did between mother and daughter. "Isabella, I'm not trying to control you. I'm trying to help you see the right path. You've always gotten involved with the wrong people and made decisions that put you at risk, Marcia argued, her maternal concern clearly showing. Mom, you never let me be myself. You always think you know what's best for me. It's not fair. Isabella shot back, her frustration evident. Not wanting to prolong the argument, Isabella took Eduardo and left, leaving Marcia and Dario worried and a bit desolate. Marcia felt a deep pain seeing her daughter leave again, especially taking Eduardo, whose stability she valued so much. After Isabella and Eduardo left, Marcia and Dario were left in silence, pondering the future and what it held for them all. Dario was clearly worried, but Marcia, despite also being concerned, tried to offer some comfort. Dario, let's give her a chance. Maybe Isabella needs this time with Eduardo to realize the importance of motherhood. And if something goes wrong, we'll be here for Eduardo, just as we always have been, Marcia said, trying to keep hope alive. Both knew that the path ahead would be difficult, but they were determined to do whatever it took to ensure Eduardo grew up in a loving and safe environment, regardless of the challenges Isabella might bring. The unfolding situation between Dario, Isabella, and Eduardo had been tense and emotionally exhausting. Dario, with Marcia's unwavering support, was deeply concerned about Eduardo's well-being and could hardly believe that Isabella had suddenly decided not only to stay with the child but also to demand child support. When Dario shared the news with Marcia, she was equally shocked by her daughter's stance. How can she do this? Marcia lamented, her voice trembling with indignation. She's barely been present in Eduardo's life, and now she wants to take everything from you, Dario. I just don't understand. Marcia, I just want what's best for Eduardo, Dario replied, his expression heavy with concern. The days leading up to the trial were difficult. Both Marcia and Dario felt a painful void from Eduardo's absence, whose joy and innocence had become an essential part of their lives. Finally, the day of the trial arrived. Dario and Isabella faced each other in court, a setting charged with tension and anticipation. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a keen gaze, listened intently to the lawyer's arguments before starting her questioning. Mr. Dario, since when have you been taking care of Eduardo? The judge asked. Since his birth, Your Honor, Dario replied, his voice steady. And Ms. Isabella, what have you been doing for the boy? The judge turned to Isabella. Dario hesitated, looking at Isabella, who quickly interjected. I visit my son, Isabella said, trying to sound confident. The judge responded with a hint of sarcasm. Congratulations for doing the bare minimum. She then continued, looking directly at Dario. And does she contribute financially to the boy's care? No, Your Honor, Dario answered plainly. Why do you want custody of Eduardo and on top of that, child support? The judge directed her question back to Isabella. And now that I'm not in a relationship, I want to be more present in my son's life. And since Dario earns more than I do, I think it's fair for him to help me financially, Isabella explained, trying to justify her position. And why did you always leave Eduardo with Dario? The judge asked. I was in a relationship with a violent man and spent little time with my son, Isabella confessed, lowering her gaze. After hearing the confession, the judge paused before speaking again. Isabella, you allowed a violent man into your home and prioritized him over your own son. Your actions put your son's life at risk, and yet, you are asking for child support from a man who took care of your child without any legal obligation. The room fell silent as the judge took a dramatic pause, everyone waiting for her decision. I have made my decision, the judge announced. Isabella, you will be required to pay child support to Dario, as he will be taking care of Eduardo. Custody of Eduardo will be granted to Dario, and if he wishes, he may register the boy in his name. Isabella, visibly shocked and furious with the decision, had to swallow her anger. She wanted to protest, to shout against what she felt was an unjust decision, but she knew that any outburst of emotion would only worsen her situation. Marcia and Dario, relieved by the court's decision, felt gratified knowing that Eduardo would be safe and well cared for. As they walked out of the courtroom, Marcia placed her hand on Dario's shoulder, offering a silent thank you for the love and dedication he had shown to her grandson. The bond between them had been further strengthened by this ordeal, and they both knew that, from now on, all that mattered was Eduardo's well-being. After the tumultuous court decision, Eduardo, Marcia, and Dario's lives gradually returned to their normal routine. Marcia, in particular, found immense joy and purpose in caring for her grandson, cherishing every moment spent with him, teaching him, and watching him grow. Dario's home became a haven of love and care, a place where Eduardo could feel safe and loved. One day, Isabella showed up at Dario's house, an unexpected visit that brought with it an initial wave of tension. With tearful eyes and a trembling voice, Isabella expressed her desire to spend some time with Eduardo.
Irili mis maison, Dario.
I would like to spend a little time with him, Isabella said, clearly nervous about how her request would be received. Dario, cautious but understanding the importance of the mother-child bond, agreed to Isabella's request but imposed one condition. "All right, Isabella, you can spend time with him, but Marcia will be present," he said, unwilling to risk Eduardo's safety. Isabella hesitated for a moment but finally agreed, acknowledging that this was the only way to be with her son at that time. During the visit, Marcia watched Isabella interacting with Eduardo. She noticed that, despite her past faults, Isabella seemed genuinely trying to connect with her son. Marcia, though still wary and cautious, began to see signs of change in her daughter, even though she knew only time would tell if these changes were genuine and lasting. Isabella's visits became more frequent, and over time, the relationship between mother and daughter, Marcia and Isabella, began to show signs of strengthening. There was still a visible distance between them, a remnant of past pains and misunderstandings, but Eduardo's presence served as a bridge between the two. On one of these visits, while Eduardo played quietly, Isabella opened her heart to Marcia. "Mom, I miss Dad so much. That's why I named Eduardo after him. I wanted something of him to stay with me," Isabella confessed, her words laden with nostalgia and pain.
"I know, dear.
"Your father loved you very much, and I'm sure he would be proud to see the man Eduardo is becoming," Marcia replied, feeling a pang of sadness as she remembered her husband. "And why did you always leave Eduardo with Dario?"
the judge asked.
"I was in a relationship with a violent man and spent little time with my son," Isabella admitted, lowering her gaze. The judge, after hearing the confession, paused for a moment before speaking. "Isabella, you allowed a violent man into your home and favored him over your own son. Your actions put your child's life at risk, and yet you're asking for alimony from a man who cared for your son without any legal obligation." The room fell silent as the judge took a dramatic pause, everyone waiting for her decision. "I have made my decision," the judge announced. "Isabella, you will be required to pay alimony to Dario, as he will be taking care of Eduardo. Custody of Eduardo will remain with Dario, and if he wishes, he may register the boy in his name." Isabella, visibly shocked and furious with the decision, had to swallow her anger. She wanted to protest, to shout against the decision she felt was unjust, but she knew that any outburst would only worsen her situation. Marcia and Dario, relieved by the court's decision, felt gratified knowing Eduardo would be safe and well cared for. As they walked out of the courthouse, Marcia placed her hand on Dario's shoulder, offering a silent thank you for the love and dedication he had shown to her grandson. The bond between them had been further strengthened by this trial, and they both knew that from now on, all that mattered was Eduardo's well-being. After the tumultuous court decision, Eduardo's, Marcia's, and Dario's lives gradually returned to their normal routine. Marcia, in particular, found immense joy and purpose in caring for her grandson, cherishing every moment spent with him, teaching him, and watching him grow. Dario's home became a refuge of love and care, a place where Eduardo could feel safe and loved. One day, Isabella showed up at Dario's house, an unexpected visit that brought with it a wave of tension. With tearful eyes and a trembling voice, Isabella expressed her desire to spend some time with Eduardo. "I really miss my son, Dario. I'd like to spend a little time with him," Isabella said, clearly nervous about how her request would be received. Dario, cautious but understanding the importance of the mother-child bond, agreed to Isabella's request but imposed one condition. "All right, Isabella, you can spend time with him, but Marcia will be present." He said this unwilling to take any risks with Eduardo's safety. Isabella hesitated for a moment but finally agreed, recognizing that this was the only way to be with her son at that time. During the visit, Marcia observed Isabella interacting with Eduardo. She noticed that, despite her past flaws, Isabella seemed genuinely trying to connect with her son. Marcia, though still suspicious and cautious, began to see signs of change in her daughter, though she knew that only time could tell if these changes were real and lasting. Isabella's visits became more frequent, and over time, the relationship between Marcia and Isabella began to show signs of strengthening. There was still a visible distance between them, a remnant of past hurts and misunderstandings, but Eduardo's presence acted as a bridge between them. On one of these visits, while Eduardo played quietly, Isabella opened her heart to Marcia.
Mom, I miss Dad so much.
That's why I named Eduardo after him. I wanted something of him to stay with me, Isabella confessed, her words laden with nostalgia and pain.
I know, dear.
Your father loved you very much, and I'm sure he would be proud to see the man Eduardo is becoming, Marcia replied, feeling a pang of sadness as she remembered her husband. Moved by these shared emotions, Marcia, Isabella, and Eduardo decided to visit the cemetery where Eduardo's grandfather was buried. Together, they walked through the quiet paths of the cemetery until they reached Eduardo's grandfather's grave. There the three of them joined in a prayer, a moment of peace and reflection on the past, present, and future. As they stood up to leave, a gentle breeze blew over them, bringing a sense of freshness and renewal. It seemed in some way, a sign that despite all the challenges and storms they had faced, there was hope and the possibility of a better future.